your questions for our speakers. We're going to introduce the next speaker, and then we'll have a question session. You can send those again to nobelconference@gustavus.edu. At this point, it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage Kelly Nett, Professor of Psychological Science, who will introduce our next speaker.
It's my honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nicole Avena. Dr. Avena earned her PhD in neuroscience and psychology from Princeton University, where she initiated groundbreaking research on the relationship between drugs of abuse and sugar. Her early work critically investigated how high levels of sugar exposure can influence the effects of drugs of abuse. Following her doctoral work, Dr. Avena held a postdoctoral research fellowship at the Rockefeller University, where she further explored the overlap between the brain circuits involved in drug addiction and those activated by sugar. This pioneering work has been crucial in shifting our collective understanding of addiction, challenging the long-held notion that only traditional addictive substances could drive an addictive response. Dr. Avena is currently an associate professor of neuroscience at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and a visiting associate professor at Princeton University. Her research continues to expand our understanding of the complex link between the neurobiology of addiction, obesity, and food behaviors. Her work has been continuously supported by federal funding from the National Institute of Health and has resulted in the publication of over 70 peer-reviewed articles. Dr. Avena has also contributed to several academic book chapters and authored books of her own, including Sugarless: Uncover Hidden Sugars, Curb Your Cravings, and Conquer Your Addiction. Dr. Avena works to make her research accessible as both a consultant and public speaker, utilizing her expertise in nutrition and food addiction to bring evidence-based perspectives to general audiences interested in better understanding how our brains drive food choice and behavior. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our next speaker, Dr. Nicole Avena.
Okay, well, thank you, Kelly, for the kind introduction, and thank you so much for the honor of being here. This is really an amazing conference, and I'm so grateful for all the hard work that's gone into putting it together, and I'm very, very grateful to be a part of it. So what I'm going to talk about today in the brief time that we have together is really a culmination of my life work. So to me, this is more than just giving a little bit of a talk. This is actually work that I started day one of graduate school. And believe it or not, I'm still working on it. And so to me, this is quite a bit of work. So I want to cover in the time we have together a discussion on the evolving landscape of addiction, because as Kelly just mentioned, we've moved beyond just thinking about addiction as being something that is restricted to just drugs and alcohol. And so the landscape has significantly changed. I want to talk a little bit about things that drive us to eat. It's no longer the case that we just eat for calories. In a perfect world, yes, we would only eat when we're hungry, but we all know that there's lots of different reasons why people eat, and sugar plays a role in that. I want to talk a little bit about sugar in our foods. We have a change in our food environment that has been going on over the past 50 years or so, and sugar has become a common denominator in that change, and so I want to walk through some of that. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing over the years looking at this concept of food addiction, and particularly sugar, and whether or not foods that contain high amounts of added sugar can actually meet the criteria for being addictive substances. And then lastly, I'd like to leave with just some thoughts on how we might move forward, understanding this research and the evidence that we're seeing mounting around how sugar affects our health. So as I mentioned, the landscape of addiction has evolved, and I think in many ways this is going to be something that's greatly going to benefit society. It used to be the case that when we thought about addiction, it was traditionally thought of things that are substances like morphine, heroin, alcohol. But we have now the introduction of behavioral addictions into our lexicon, and we can really credit the introduction of gambling as being recognized by the American Psychiatric Association as an addictive disorder to that. And so now that we have this ability to recognize that there can be behavioral addictions or patterns of behavior that can get out of control, that can interfere with our daily life and meet the criteria for being addictive, has really opened up the door for us to start to look at other behaviors, including eating behaviors in some case, and whether or not, in combination with the types of foods we're eating, which I'll hopefully convince you, in my opinion, can be considered more on the substance side of things as opposed to the food side of things, could potentially have us understanding this idea of behavioral addictions in a more broad concept. Now, this whole idea of sugar and addiction is something that's relatively new in the sense that, our group was really one of the first to begin to study this back in the year 2000, 2001, but it wasn't entirely new. If you go back to the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book, back into the 1930s, and this is the book that was a manual that was put together for individuals who are struggling with alcohol use disorder and provided guidance on what to do as you're working through the steps. One of the steps that was mentioned, and one of the tips that's mentioned, is if you have an alcohol craving, eat some sugar. That'll help you. So we knew even back then in the 1930s that sugar could help alleviate your alcohol cravings. So that underscores the fact that they're operating in some way on a level that is similar. If you can alleviate your cravings for alcohol by simply having something that tastes sweet, that suggests that there's a common underlying neural circuitry. So we did have hints of this kind of brewing over time. One of the questions that I've been asking, and I'm sure many of us have been asking, is why do so many people struggle with eating a healthy diet? And this is really what kind of kicked off this research line for me. I was a first-year college graduate, so I was first-generation college student, had just landed at Princeton with a huge case of imposter syndrome, assuming that they were going to come in any minute and tell me that they made the mistake in admitting me. And I was meeting with my advisor, and we were going over what I was going to study for my dissertation, which was going to be this huge 5-year-long project. And back in the year 2000, the sort of sentiment was that we were starting to hear more about obesity rates going up, but it was thought that if you had obesity, it was because you didn't have the self-control. The onus was really put on the individual struggling with obesity. It was more of a self-control issue as opposed to something else. And so we started talking about different ideas of what I might study, and one of the things that had perplexed me was, well, we have this billion-dollar diet industry out there with all of this information. How come it's so difficult for people to eat healthy, even when they're facing, severe forms of diabetes, severe forms of obesity, all these medical complications? That's still not enough to get them to eat healthy. Why is that? It doesn't make sense. And so we started to toss around this idea that, well, maybe it's actually not the people. Maybe it's the food. Maybe it's what's going on in our food environment that could be causing people to be compelled to overeat these foods. Maybe people are addicted to them, just like people can get addicted to drugs and alcohol. So that's really what kind of kicked this question off for me. Now, if you take a look at the obesity rates, we see that over time, obesity rates have been going up. If you look in the United States, as we just saw, obesity rates are around 40%, but this is something that's a global issue as well. And if we see, when we travel to other countries and start to see countries that have more of a Western influence now and more processed food being introduced into their food culture, those countries are starting to see their obesity rates going up as well. So there is this correlation between obesity rates going up and our food culture changing in the way that involves more of these ultra-processed foods that are very high in sugar. Now, another thing that's changed is our food accessibility. So we evolved from hunters and gatherers. We used to walk around the forest and hunt for a berry bush and maybe find an animal. You probably had to chase them for a while. And, it was not sure when you were going to get your next meal, but when you did find that berry bush, you ate all the berries. And when you found the animal and were hunting them down, you enjoyed your meal. It was a lot of work, and I'm kind of glad I missed that, and my ancestors dealt with that. But nonetheless, when we look at what's going on in our modern food environment, this is the hunting and gathering, the middle panel. We go to our grocery stores, we take our shopping carts, we load it up with all kinds of food, we bring it home to our refrigerated homes and our pantries that can hold things for months, if not years. And so due to advancements in technology, we are now able to not have to hunt for our food, which is great. But we have to ask, has this come at some cost? Because now we're in a situation where we can eat in excess relatively easily. And it's even gotten easier. You don't even need to go to the grocery store. You could just take out your phone and click a couple buttons, and someone will show up on a bike and bring you basically whatever you want to eat. So again, the way in which we procure our food has very much changed, and we have to ask, well, how has this potentially contribute to some of the maladaptive eating patterns that we find ourselves having? Another thing we need to consider is portion sizes. Now, if we take a look over time, portion sizes have gone up dramatically. So if you think sort of back then, when we had a typical serving size of ice cream, for example, it would be a half a cup. Well, updated serving sizes have now said that no, a typical serving size is 2/3 of a cup. Same if you take a look at other types of foods, including, hamburgers. If you go to a restaurant, we saw about sodas. The sizes of our portions are going up and up. And if anything, we need the sizes to probably be going down because most of us are in more sedentary jobs than our ancestors were. So if anything, we need fewer calories than we did 50 years ago. But that's not the case. We're seeing the opposite happen, where our portion sizes are increasing while our exercise and our ability to burn off calories is actually decreasing. So when I first started doing this research, we were interested in understanding whether or not food could be addictive. Could sugar-rich foods be addictive? That was the thesis question. And I'd say probably first 10 years of my career, I spent an awful lot of time talking about the addiction piece because we wanted to make sure we were defining addiction correctly. And more recently, I've changed my opinion on this. I still will talk about addiction, I'll get to that in a minute, but I think the more important question, if actually the most important question any of us can ask ourselves right now is this question: what is a food? Because I think we all have had this historical preconceived idea of what food is, but that has changed in terms of what we presently have available to us that's being promoted as being food. So let me give you some examples. This is a food. I think we can all agree that if you go to the store and buy a bag of apples, you'll see on the ingredients list, it'll tell you it's apples. But we also have other things that are also a food. So this is just one example of many. So we have Apple Jacks. Now, Apple Jacks are a cereal that are promoted towards children, and as you can see, there's very little apple in here. I don't even know if apple is actually even an ingredient, but there's lots of other things in here. Now, the point is that apples and Apple Jacks are not the same thing, yet they fall under this umbrella term of food. And so the question I have is, are these the same thing, and should we be treating them the same way in terms of how we think about and contextualize food? We can see this across the board if you look at other types of foods that we commonly would eat. When we take a look at the number of ingredients 30, 40, 50 years ago compared to now, you can see that things like potato chips, even chicken nuggets, it used to be chicken nuggets or chicken, salt, vinegar, and batter. Okay, well, we now see that the laundry list of ingredients has changed quite a bit. We have a lot more ingredients in these things now. Same with things like bread, tomato soup. Basic staples that people have enjoyed for years and years have now changed in the ways in which they're put together. And the big change here is that these have become ultra-processed foods. So we've changed the way in which we design these foods to make them more shelf-stable, to make them more attractive, perhaps. Maybe they're going to, not develop mold as quickly, so we add some preservatives and other ingredients. But we've also added, in many cases, things to make them more palatable and to mask, perhaps, some of the off-putting tastes that we add when we add a lot of those preservatives and things to make them shelf-stable. And one of those ingredients is sugar. Now, this has gone beyond just, looking at then and now. We have to start thinking about emerging threats. And so in looking at this from the addiction lens, we are now starting to see, if you look across the bottom panel, some emerging threats of companies that are creating food products that are basically having things like Delta-8, which is a highly synthetic form of THC, and putting them into products that are also marketed as being food-like substances. And so, again, we're seeing that some of these drug substances are piggybacking off of the fact that these foods are so delicious and palatable. And again, these are things that are heavily marketed towards children. So we're seeing this progression that's, in my opinion, getting very, very dangerous. So I mentioned the portion sizes have gone up. This is certainly something that we have to cope with and we've seen over the years. And one of the things that we've noticed is this is across the board. It's not just one item, it's multiple different items. And that is something that again, when we're given a portion of something put in front of us, we tend to think, well, this is what we have to eat. This is what I was given. That's the psychology of how our brains work when we think about appetite. So I started off getting interested in this field because of obesity, but what I've come to learn is that there's no single cure for obesity because there's so many contributing factors. And so we talked about some of these things like food accessibility, portion sizes, sedentary lifestyle, genetics. We could spend a whole day talking about each one of these, but what I want to focus on today is this sort of newer piece, this idea about the food hedonics, the rewarding aspect of the food. Is there something special about the taste of the food that's driving people to perhaps develop an addiction to it? So one of the big things that we see when we look at apples and Apple Jacks is that Apple Jacks are a highly processed food. Okay, that's the big difference here that we're introducing into this question. We now have this category of ultra-processed food. And so you might say, well, what's the big deal about processing? You process a steak when you sear it, right? You peel a banana when you eat it. There's nothing inherently wrong with processing, but I think that we have taken it too far in some cases, and you can change something by processing it, especially when you take it from its original form. So let me give you some examples. This is a coca leaf, and in parts of the world where coca leaves grow, people will chew on the leaves. They help with altitude sickness. Some say it kind of helps to control their appetite. But never in my 20-something years in the field have I met anyone who's addicted to coca leaves, or have I met a patient who's addicted to coca leaves. But I have unfortunately met many people who, when you take those coca leaves, process them, add a bunch of ingredients and products to them, you can turn them into something that is highly addictive, like cocaine or crack cocaine. So you could take a natural substance and turn it into something that's very, very different by processing it. Same perhaps for grapes. You can have a grape-based product and process it, add some chemicals to it and preservatives, and make it into something that some people can have a hard time controlling their intake of. So perhaps the same could be said about wheat-based products. You could have a wheat-based product that once you process it and add a bunch of chemicals and things to it, it becomes very different. And maybe the same is said for water and sugar cane. When we put these things together, well, when you use them individually, there's nothing wrong with water. And even in parts of the world where sugar canes still grow, the kids will chew on them. It's really not a problem per se. But when you process those sugar canes and package them in such a way, they can potentially lead to something that can be problematic for people to control their intake of. So the point here is that processing changes the substances. And I believe that sugar is the common denominator. When we look across the board at all the ultra-processed foods that are out there that we're hearing about, sugar is the common denominator in those foods. We're seeing sugar as one of the primary ingredients, if not multiple primary ingredients, because many of these foods contain multiple forms of sugar in addition to some of the other sweeteners that the previous speaker mentioned, and in addition to other types of sweeteners. So why worry about sugar? Well, it used to be the case that we only had sugar around the holidays or special occasions. If you look back into the 1800s, the average sugar consumption per person was less than 2 pounds a year. Now, if you look forward into the year 2000 and beyond, you see that that number has gone up dramatically. We now consume over 100 pounds of sugar per person per year. So we've seen over time, our sugar intake has gone up dramatically. Now, if you layer on top of those data the obesity prevalence, we didn't really see much obesity here until like around the later part of the 1800s, but around 1900 we started tracking obesity. And you can see that as we started to see this climb in sugar intake, we also started to see this steep climb in obesity rates. Again, it's a correlation, but this does ask the question, is there a relationship between these two things? Now, as we know, there's recommendations about how much sugar we should be consuming. 17 teaspoons is what the average person consumes, which is already much higher than what is recommended. The recommendations are much, much lower than that. And so right off the bat, we're seeing that society is struggling with having an excessive amount of sugar intake beyond what the guidelines that we now have are suggesting. So why is it so hard for people to reduce their sugar intake in particular? And again, this is something that is a question that many people struggle with, especially if they themselves are personally trying to, cut back on eating too much sugar or trying to lose weight, or maybe, trying to change their diet due to some health concerns that have come up. Well, I'll get into the addiction piece in a few minutes. I do think that one of the primary reasons why we are seeing that so many people struggle with cutting back on sugar is because it can produce an addiction, and I'm going to walk you through some of the data on that. But we need to keep in mind that there's other factors too that can contribute. We have to think about the advertising, okay? So we have celebrities that are endorsing, certain fast food meals and certain food products that are, again, promoting these types of products in our environment that's going to promote awareness of them and encourage people to consume them and use them, which, again, can potentially feed into the addiction. We also know that there's lots of different reasons why people eat. People eat to self-medicate. People eat for emotional reasons. People eat because it makes them feel better, because it actually does. It produces the release of chemicals in the brain that make you feel better. So there's lots of other factors that are going on as to why people eat that can contribute to overeating sugar, but a lot of them also can feed back into this addiction piece as well. So when we look at the brain, one of the things that we see is that drugs of abuse, I'm talking about nicotine, alcohol, the traditional drugs that we think of that are abused, they actually evolved to reinforce, they act on systems in the brain that evolved to reinforce natural behavior. So we don't have a cocaine system and an alcohol system and a food system. We actually have a reward system in the brain. And so one of the reasons why drugs can be so addictive, especially highly synthetic, highly powerful drugs like fentanyl, for example, is because they overactivate this brain reward system. So we had this reward system in place to make sure we would engage in behaviors that are going to help us survive as a species, so that we would enjoy sexual behavior, we would enjoy eating, right? Because if you enjoy something, you'll do it over and over again, right? That's how our brain made us do these things over and over so we could survive as a species. But drugs are able to overactivate that system, and that's why they can become so addictive. So the point here is to illustrate the fact that we have this limbic system, this reward pathway in our brains, and that the neural pathways are there to suggest that there's overlaps, and that maybe some of these highly palatable foods, these ultra-processed foods, could actually be activating the brain in ways that's more like what happens with a drug, and less like what we've traditionally seen happening with food. So, in addition to the addiction, we know that the amount of sugar-sweetened foods that we have in our food supply has been going up and up over time. This is some older data, but even back in 2013, this particular study showed that 68% of the packaged foods and beverages that were produced in grocery stores or purchased nationally in grocery stores contain caloric sweeteners. So this means that when you go to the grocery store and you're foraging for your food, you actually really need to do some serious foraging, because most of the foods contain added sugar. So if you're looking for something that doesn't have added sugar, you're going to have to really hunt for it. Also adding to the addiction is the fact that we often don't realize how much how much sugar we're consuming. Now, if you take a look at just, this particular example, one beverage here, we all know that this isn't a health food, but let's face it, people enjoy these things from time to time, maybe a little too often. By just having one of these caramel frappuccinos, you can get 64 grams of sugar. And so that's 128% of the daily recommended amount of sugar. So if you have just one of these, you've already dipped into tomorrow's allotment of how much added sugar would be recommended. Now, we know that obviously that's a sweet treat. You're not supposed to have those all the time, but there are some foods that are considered healthy foods that are staples in our diet, or should be, that also can contain excessive amounts of sugar, and many people don't realize it. So if you take a look at some yogurts, especially ones that say they have fruit on the bottom, well, unfortunately, the fruit isn't really fruit. It's like a fruit compote extract type of thing with flavoring, and essentially, at the end of the day, just one of these is going to give you 24 grams of added sugar, which is 48% of the daily recommended value. So again, half the amount of sugar for the day can be had just at breakfast when you think you're eating something healthy. Another thing is that we're seeing sugar sneaking into places where we wouldn't expect it. So I'm expecting there to be sugar in my Frappuccino. I'm expecting there maybe to be sugar even in my yogurt. I'm not expecting there to be sugar in my pizza. But nonetheless, when we take a look at some of these ultra-processed foods, many of them contain sugar. In this particular case, we have 26% of the daily recommended value. So again, we're finding sugar sneaking into various different parts of our diet, and in many cases it's unbeknownst to us. But it does add up over time when we start to put all these different foods together over the course of the day. So I'd like to take a little time to talk about some of the research that we've been doing looking at this from an empirical standpoint. So what we've done to define addiction is to use the DSM criteria, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is the book that American Psychiatric Association uses to classify all the different mental health conditions out there and provide criteria that practitioners can use to help identify whether or not someone is struggling with one. For substance use disorder, which are the criteria used to classify, our quintessential addiction to drugs or alcohol, you have a variety of different criteria that can be met. If you meet 0 to 1 of these, you don't have a substance use disorder. But if you meet a couple, you have a mild, a few more, you have a moderate, and 6 or more, you have a severe form of substance use disorder. So essentially what we've been doing is taking these criteria and developing studies to test, can sugar produce those criteria? And see whether or not we see that effect happening. So when we first started doing this work, again, like I said, we started off using animal models, in part because we couldn't find any people that didn't have sugar in their diet, because there would be no control group if that was the case. But we also were interested in looking at the brains and the neural circuitry. So we developed an animal model where we gave rats 12 hours a day access to a sugar solution, which was similar concentration to a soda beverage. They always had food available, so they're never forced to eat the sugar for calories, and they always had water available, so they're never forced to eat it for hydration. What we ended up discovering was that the animals that had this 12-hour a day access developed this binge-like pattern of intake. And so when we would give them access to the sugar each day over the course of the experiment, this is the black columns, they would develop this binging behavior. And interestingly, we didn't see this in animals that had 12 hours a day access to just healthy rat food. They just ate it normally. So there's something special about 12 hours a day, this limited window, which isn't really all that limited because most of the other 12 hours, the animals are asleep. But there's something about having this limited daily access that promoted this binge-like behavior. It also promoted tolerance, which again is another indication of addiction, in the sense that these animals were consuming more and more and more of the sugar solution over the course of a month. So they're increasing their intake, and they're also developing a binge-like response to it. Now, one of the primary questions we had from the neuroscience perspective is, well, what's going to happen in the reward system? We know that drugs of abuse, a hallmark of drugs of abuse is that they release a neurochemical called dopamine in the brain every time they're administered. Every time someone smokes a cigarette, every time someone does cocaine, it's going to increase dopamine levels. That's nature of how it works, to produce this addiction and the reward. Food doesn't normally do that. Normally when you have a food, if it's a new food, you never had it before, yes, it'll release dopamine because you're paying attention. But over time, if it's safe and you don't get sick from it, your brain isn't releasing dopamine in response. So the question we had is, well, what's going to happen with sugar? Is sugar going to release dopamine like it's a drug or like it's a food? Well, it turns out that when we look at these animals and we do these experiments where we give the animals sucrose to drink and then we can measure their extracellular fluid and put it into our analytical chemistry machines, we see that sugar indeed is releasing dopamine in all the animals and all the groups that we're testing on day 1. And this makes sense because it's the first time they ever tasted sugar. But if we look out onto day 2 and even day 21 of the experiment, it's only the animals that are binging on the sugar that are producing this release of dopamine. Animals that have sugar once in a while, or sugar just kind of nibble on it here and there, they're not producing this increase in dopamine levels. So there's something special about the overconsumption of sugar that's driving this addiction-like response in the brain and producing this change in the dopamine system. If you look on the bottom, we see that this isn't happening when animals are given their quote-unquote binge access or limited access to healthy food. They just eat all their food within that window, and they don't show a significant increase in dopamine. So this is suggesting that in many ways, dopamine is being released in a way that's more like a drug when it comes to sugar, and less like what's supposed to happen when it's a food. Now, we've also seen evidence of withdrawal emerging. We see that this happens in our laboratory rats. When we take a look from our preclinical studies, they'll show signs of anxiety, they'll show signs of aggression, they'll show signs of depression. irritability when we take the sugar away, not unlike what happens on usually like January 5th or 6th when everybody decides to go off their New Year's diet and suddenly everyone's cranky and snapping at their roommate and just, not fun to be around. And people have this sort of low mood. It can happen, and it's real, and we have some evidence from clinical studies that have recently been published that have looked at a processed food withdrawal scale and found that, yes, indeed, the withdrawal symptoms, this irritability, crankiness, just sort of, unhappy feeling that we can experience, does seem to peak between days 2 and 5 of cutting back or cutting out sugars and ultra-processed food. Now, one other study I wanted to share with you has to do with the fact that, again, we're talking about sugar, and I'm talking about sugar as the common denominator, and I think it's important that we sort of study this through the lens of ultra-processed food because, as we saw in our last speaker, yes, sugar-sweetened beverages is certainly a big source of our intake of sugars, but we also have this other ultra-processed food piece that contains a lot of added sugars. We're mostly eating our sugar via ultra-processed food. So in this particular study, we gave our rats a variety of different foods, a cafeteria diet it's called, and it's basically kind of like a buffet where they get cheese, chips, cookies, marshmallows, peanut butter, all that kind of stuff. And when you have animals on a diet like that, they develop cafeteria diet-induced obesity, DIO. Now, what was interesting here is we had these animals and we gave them amphetamine, which is a dopamine stimulant. And we found that if we have animals that have a history of eating a dietary-induced obesity diet, they're overweight from being on this cafeteria diet, they're also hypersensitive to amphetamine. So they're releasing more dopamine in response to getting amphetamine compared to animals that are eating a healthy diet. So this suggests that their brains have changed as a result of their diet that's now dysregulating the way that they respond to other things that stimulate dopamine, including a drug. What I think is most interesting about this study, though, is if you look at the bottom, we decided to give all the animals in the study lab chow, which is like healthy rat food. And the animals in the control group, they started to show an increase in dopamine because they were happy to get food back because we had mildly food deprived them, so they were just happy to get something to eat. But we didn't see that in the cafeteria diet group. It wasn't until we gave them the junk food back that these animals showed an increase in dopamine levels. So again here, their brains have changed. Being on a diet of all these processed foods, all these foods that are rich in sugars, has made it such that the healthy food isn't rewarding. And so it's only when they get the junk food back that they show that dopaminergic response. So if we can extrapolate this to people who are struggling, we can see why it can be a barrier to change your diet. If you have a diet of all of these different processed foods with all these added sugars and then suddenly decide, okay, I'm going to eat a salad today, I'm going to just feel great, that's not what happens in the brain. So this does serve as a bit of a barrier. And we've seen this happening in some clinical studies as well. There's been some fMRI studies that have been going on that have basically been showing the same thing, that when you see a food or taste a food that is highly palatable, it's going to affect the brain and the brain reward system in a way that suggests it's promoting an addiction-like response, not necessarily the response you would typically see if you just had a taste of something to drink or a taste of something that wasn't quite so delicious. We've been looking at this through the lens, too, of helping to understand, which foods are addictive. One of our studies that came out a few years ago, we did a study where we cataloged different foods and characterized them based on which foods were most addictive and which foods were least addictive. A couple interesting things came of this. The first one was that people said, why'd you even study this? Everybody knows pizza is a highly addictive food. But this was really the first study to experimentally look at this and to understand that what it is about these foods, like pizza, chocolate, chips, cookies, ice cream, it's the positive predictor of whether or not it was associated with being identified as an addictive food was the level of processing. So the more highly processed the food, the more likely it was to be identified as being an addictive food in terms of this study. So I'm running out of time, so I want to wrap up a couple last points. But basically, to summarize, if the question is, is sugar addictive? The answer is yes. When we take a look at the criteria for an addictive substance, sugar, ultra-processed food is able to meet all of those criteria in animal models and also in clinical studies as well. So the take-home that I often get is it really like a drug of addiction? People will often push back and say, well, people aren't robbing the liquor store to go buy, a cookie. But the thing I need to say about that is that, well, if you take a look at the loss of control that we typically think about with addiction, it actually isn't as extreme as we think. Yes, there's people who have trouble with the law, who face issues with societal problems as a result of their addiction, but the most common addict in our society is the person on the bottom, which is a smoker. This is a fully functioning individual, little noticeable intoxication. Withdrawal syndrome is not life-threatening, but because of the health-related complications that smoking provides, it's still the #1 preventable cause of death. So if we're going to think about sugar and processed food in terms of addiction, we need to think about it in the way we thought about tobacco. And for those of us that are in the room old enough to remember, it used to be the case in the 1950s, 1960s, 60% of Americans were smoking, right? Just like we're seeing now, 40% of Americans are obese. So over time, we've seen a big change in terms of the way people use tobacco products, and hopefully we'll see something similar happening with food. So next steps, just to wrap things up, living sugar less. We're in this phase of our life now in our food environment, and I think that this will obviously change as time goes on, where we have this new introduction of a category into the lexicon of the umbrella term of food, and that is the ultra-processed food. And we need to figure out how do we reconcile this and how do we live with this, because the reality is we need processed food. We can't feed all the people on this planet with farms alone. We just don't have the abilities to do that. So there is a place for processed food, but I would argue there probably isn't much of a place for ultra-processed food, especially based on how addictive these substances can be. So just some quick tips to kind of wrap things up on going sugar less. And I really do feel that the point is to do less sugar, not to cold turkey quit it, because we know that a harm reduction approach in many cases is a better strategy than having people do nothing at all, which, again, with the pervasiveness of sugar and how common it is and how it's hidden in so many of our foods, I think completely cutting out sugar would not be possible. So it's so important to be able to identify the hidden sugars on ingredients labels, know the different names for sugar. It's not just sugar and high fructose corn syrup. There's like 300 different names now, so it's important to understand what those things are and understand if it is in fact an added sugar. Reducing wherever you can, I think, is critical. If you have 3 sugars in your coffee, start having 2. I swear you won't notice in 4 days, and it'll taste the same. Cutting back where you can is really the best way to get to that goal of reducing. Having a plan for facing cravings, I think this is a really important one, because many people end up eating something that they know is not healthy when they're in a bind and don't have something healthy available. They're faced with some sort of stressor where they got stuck late at work and now they got to get something out of the vending machine. So having a plan for facing cravings. Also starting with your beverages, as we heard about in the previous talk, it's so important to cut back on sugar-sweetened beverages because they don't produce the same type of satiety as we would have if you actually eat the food, including fruit smoothies and things like that. Focusing on whole, unprocessed food, managing our stress, because again, there's a lot of our eating that is stress-induced, and people will eat to self-medicate stress and to manage their stress because of effects that sugar can have on our brain and helping us to momentarily feel better. And then having a supportive environment by removing temptations, and so not having soda in your house if it's something that is going to cause you to want to consume it is a small, simple thing you can do to help to reduce some of the temptations that can come along. Okay, so the take home is that our brains have changed. If we look at our brain, especially in the context of addiction, it's difficult to say just eat it in moderation, right? Because we know that if something is addictive, it's very difficult to eat it in moderation. And that's where I think this harm reduction approach comes in, and we're hearing a lot more about that in the addiction literature as well. But to tell people that they should just eat less of it can be a difficult thing for many people, and that's why we need to do this in the context of many other supportive components. So at the end of the day, I don't think sugar is the same as cocaine. I know that kind of gets tossed around on social media a lot. We hear a lot about these different sort of analogies that people make. It's very different, obviously, for various reasons, but I do think that based on the pervasiveness, the impact on health, and the impact on longevity, that it can be just as addictive, and it can be just as powerfully bad for our health. And so I think we need to consider this within the context of the fact that, Imagine if we had little bits of cocaine like sprinkled in our food here and there, right? Just like we have for sugar. And we're eating little bits of it throughout the day. We didn't even realize it. Our kids were getting it. We didn't even realize it. It adds up, and we would be, in an uproar. So I think we need to consider that within the context of sugar as well. And thank you for listening.
Well, now, if you would like to take a few minutes to kind of stretch in place, please don't leave. We're going to set up the panel and get everyone hooked up with mics, so it will take us a few minutes to do that. And while we're doing that, I'm going to briefly introduce the next speakers who will be joining us up here. Yeah, they're going to set up the table and everything.
Hey everybody, this is the Gustavus Nobel Conference. You are watching the live stream. My name is Tane Danger.
I'm Maggie Kurth.
We're your co-host, and we just got done with our first 2 lectures and a beautiful academic procession.
Indeed.
And as much as I would love to talk about the music in the academic procession, we should talk about our first 2 talks.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this. I'm curious to see the Q&A after this because watching the last lecture by Nicole Avena, there were some things that she was saying from a perspective of like a neuroscientist that contradicted what I understand and have heard from food scientists. Like the concept of, not the concept of like in general, the idea that like too much sugar is not good for you. And there is